December 22nd, 1941. 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a 16-year-old boy named Herman Scearce stood in line at the Danville, Virginia post office. He lied about his age, told the recruiter he was 19, and enlisted in the United States Army. Scearce came from a broken home, a family so poor he ate cornflakes and water because they could not afford milk. He had quit school to work in a cotton mill, hauling roping for $15 a week. The Army seemed like the only way out. After basic training at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, he was sent to radio school at Scott Field, Illinois, where he learned Morse code and radio theory. The work was mind-numbingly boring, but when Air Corps recruiters visited in their crisp leather jackets, Scearce volunteered on the spot. He wanted to fly. He wanted one of those jackets. He passed gunnery school at Harlingen, Texas, firing .30 caliber machine guns from the rear seat of an AT-6 Texan. By September 1942, at age 17, he was a staff sergeant, still half expecting the Army to discover his real age and send him home. In February 1943, Scearce was assigned to a B-24 Liberator crew at Davis-Monthan Field in Arizona. The pilot was a first lieutenant named Joe Deasy, a slender man with sharp blue eyes and an easy, confident manner. Deasy had replaced the crew's original pilot, who had simply disappeared one day without explanation. The crew was led by Deasy, with flight engineer Jack Yankus and radio operator Herman Scearce as the key enlisted men. The other crew members, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and 3 gunners, would learn to work as a team during phase training across bases in the Southwest. They flew worn-out Liberators, practiced bomb runs and navigation legs, and learned to trust each other. At Salina, Kansas, they took delivery of their own new aircraft, a B-24D with tail number 41-24214. The plane cost the government nearly $290,000. Yankus and Leip checked the engines. Scearce made sure the radios worked. They were eager to get into combat, finish their 30 missions, and come home heroes. On February 9, 1943, Deasy's crew flew their Liberator from Hamilton Field, California, to Hickam Field, Hawaii. The flight took more than 12 hours across open water. As they approached Oahu from the southwest, Scearce saw the dark green mountains of the Koolau Range rising in the distance. On final approach, he and the crew caught their first glimpse of the sunken battleship USS Arizona, resting beside Fort Island, its gray structure rising above a shimmering pool of oil. "Sons of bitches," Yankus muttered from his jump seat between the pilots. The crew was assigned to bases at Kahuku and later Kualoa on Oahu's northern coast. Their plane was modified at the Hickam Air Depot with a twin .50 caliber nose turret, a belly turret, and radar antennae. The fresh green paint did not match the original olive drab. The bomber looked like a battle-scarred veteran before it had ever seen combat. The crew named it Dogpatch Express. A former ground soldier named Al Marston, who had been at Schofield Barracks during the Pearl Harbor attack, volunteered to join the crew as tail gunner. Deasy approved, and Marston became a permanent member. They flew submarine patrols and training missions, chafing at the routine, not yet knowing that the real war was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. On April 17, 1943, the men of the 42nd Bomb Squadron felt a change in the air. After months of patrols and training, they were finally moving to a forward base. 23 B-24 Liberators took off from Oahu and flew southwest, stopping at Canton Island to refuel, then pressing on to Funafuti, a narrow coral atoll in the Ellis Islands. The crew of Dogpatch Express, Deasy, Yankus, Leip, Hess, and the others had joined them, ready at last for combat. Funafuti was a primitive staging base, just a coral runway and a few tents. There was no taxiway, so the Liberators parked wingtip to wingtip along the strip. The crews were called to an outdoor briefing, where an officer tapped a pointer on a map and revealed their target, Nauru, a Japanese-held phosphate island more than 1,000 miles to the northwest. The briefing officer promised the Japanese would not know they were coming. That evening, ground crews fueled each bomber with 2,700 gallons of gas and loaded 8 500-pound bombs into the bays. The men of Dogpatch Express cleaned and oiled their machine guns, checking and rechecking every piece of equipment. Jack Yankus and Bob Leip pulled the propellers through by hand, feeling for any resistance that might mean trouble. By midnight, the plane was ready, and the crew tried to grab a few hours of restless sleep. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 20th, the Liberators roared to life on Funafudi's runway. DC released the brakes, and Dogpatch Express accelerated slowly under its heavy bomb load, lifting off at 130 miles per hour. For 6 hours, the formation droned northward across an empty blue ocean. As they closed on Nauru, DC's voice came over the interphone. "Fellows, go ahead and test fire your guns." The crew moved to their positions and the plane trembled as 1050 caliber machine guns barked in quick bursts. An hour from the target, DC spoke again, his voice steady. 60 minutes from the target, boys. Man your guns." Scearce and Yankus moved to the waist windows, pushing out the wind deflectors and swinging their guns into the airstream. Almost as soon as Nauru appeared on the horizon, Japanese Zero fighters struck, coming in fast from 11 o'clock high. The air erupted with gunfire. Leip's top turret hammered, Hess fired from the nose, and Marston's twin 50s barked from the tail. Scearce gripped his 50 caliber, heart pounding, as a gray blur flashed beneath his wing. He squeezed the trigger and watched his tracers arc toward the attacking plane. The bomb run was a nightmare of flak and fighters. DC held the plane steady while the bombardier took control, 45 seconds that felt like an hour. A jagged piece of shrapnel sliced through the fuselage behind Leip's turret, cut a compressed oxygen line, and buried itself in DC's seat, less than an inch from his spine. When the bombardier called bombs away, DC pushed the yoke forward and dove for safety. But the bombs had missed the island entirely, splashing into the water just off the beach. Harold Brooks, a radio operator on another B-24 and a friend of Scearce's, was in the thick of the fight. A 20-millimeter round from a Zero struck him in the back of the head as he manned his waist gun. He was killed instantly. 5 other men in the squadron were wounded. After debriefing and a quick meal, the men tried to rest, but just after midnight, the air raid siren began to wail. Marines ran from tent to tent shouting, "Air raid!" 3 twin-engine Japanese bombers had approached from Tarawa, unseen in the darkness. Scearce and his crew scrambled from their tent into a shallow hole nearby. As the first bombs began to fall, the whistling growing louder and closer with each explosion. A salvo walked straight toward them. One bomb struck an ordnance truck parked just a few feet away and destroyed it, killing 4 men who had taken cover beneath it. A brass fire extinguisher, blasted from the truck by the explosion, landed hissing on Elmer Johnson in the shallow hole. For a long moment, the men lay frozen, convinced it was a bomb about to detonate. Then the hissing stopped, and they realized they were still alive. The raid ended with 1 B-24 burned to the ground and several others damaged. The next morning, Dogpatch Express took off from Funafuti past the smoldering wreckage of its sister aircraft. The squadron had originally planned to stay for several more days, hitting targets in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, but the Japanese raid had reduced their strength too severely. Only a few planes remained operational for the planned Tarawa strike. DC's crew headed home to Oahu, leaving the dead and the wreckage behind. The return flight was quiet, the mood sullen. Scearce sat at his radio table and thought about what he had seen. The man with the rectangular hole in his forehead, the bodies pulled from the wrecked truck, Brooks's empty gun position. The war was no longer an adventure. He had 1 mission credit now, with 29 more to go before he could go home. The number felt impossibly large. When Dogpatch Express touched down at Kualoa, the familiar green hills of Oahu looked different to the men who stepped out of the plane. They were veterans now, changed by what they had witnessed. The squadron's first combat mission had cost them 1 dead and a dozen wounded. The Japanese air raid 2 days later added more casualties and destroyed a B-24 on the ground. The price of a single mission credit was very high, and every man on the crew knew that the next one could cost them everything. Back from Funafuti, the squadron barely had time to catch its breath before a new alert sent them racing west. Word came that the Japanese might try again for Midway. On May 7th, all leaves were canceled, and the next morning 9 B-24s from the 42nd lifted off Oahu and pointed their noses toward the atoll, 1,300 miles to the northwest. Scearce and his crew joined the rush, flying Dogpatch Express into the searing white glare of Eastern Island's runway. The Navy garrison there had a seal stamped on their orders that read, "We'll hold Midway till hell freezes over," and for a week, The bomber crews lived that motto, sitting in their planes each dawn, engines idling, waiting for a takeoff signal that never came. When the Japanese fleet failed to appear, the brass decided to put the assembled firepower to use. The target was Wake Island, 1,200 miles west of Midway, a round trip that would push a Liberator to its limits. On May 15th, 2 flights of bombers climbed into the morning sky. The first wave caught the full fury of the Japanese defenses. 22 Zeros swarmed the lead B-24s. Lieutenant Thomas Esmond's plane lost an engine to a 20mm shell. Esmond fought his crippled ship toward Midway, but with fuel running low, he put the bomber down in the ocean. A submarine chaser reached his crew and pulled the survivors from the wreckage. Dogpatch Express, flying in the second wave, found the sky clear of fighters and completed its bomb run without taking a single hit. 12 days later, a different kind of mission took the squadron back over the open sea. A B-24 from another group had vanished on a flight to Australia, and the 42nd was ordered to search the waters north of Palmyra Island. Lieutenant Joe Deasy climbed into the cockpit of a borrowed plane named Daisy May. While Lieutenant Russell Phillips took the controls of a B-24, the crews called the Green Hornet, a plane with a bad reputation for sluggish handling and mechanical quirks. The 2 Liberators flew side by side for 800 miles, then split apart to begin their search legs. Hours passed with no sign of the lost aircraft. Deasy brought Daisy May down at the Navy base on Palmyra as night fell, intending to continue the search at first light. Before midnight, a sailor shook Scearce awake. Phillips' plane was overdue. For 3 days, Deasy and his crew scoured the ocean, their eyes strained against the glare of the sun on the water. On the 4th day, another crew spotted floating ration boxes. Yellow crates bobbed in the swells, and that was all. No trace of the Green Hornet or her crew was ever found. They were listed as missing in action. Scearce thought of the replacements who had filled the gaps on Phillips' crew after the Nauru mission, men who had taken the places of the wounded and ended up swallowed by the same black water. He did not say it aloud, but he understood now that survival was a roll of the dice, and the dice could come up snake eyes on any mission for any man. The squadron returned to Oahu and the grinding routine of patrols and training, but the losses kept coming in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. On June 14th, Lieutenant George Smith taxied a B-24 named Thumper II to the end of Kualoa's steel Marston Mat runway. The plane was overloaded with fuel and photo flash bombs for a reconnaissance mission to the Marshall Islands. Smith released the brakes and the Liberator began its takeoff roll, the 4 engines howling at full throttle. Halfway down the strip, the nose wheel lifted off the metal planking, but the aircraft yawed and the nose slammed back down. The strut collapsed under the weight and the bomber plowed forward on its belly, propellers shredding the steel runway into twisted ribbons. The wreck careened off the runway and stopped in a ditch beside the coast road. The 3 left engines burning. Ground crewman Sergeant Jacques Juice and Master Sergeant Joe Mack sprinted to the hulk and climbed aboard, shutting down the ignition switches before the fuel load could explode. 13 men scrambled out of the wreck, Lieutenant Smith with a fractured wrist, a co-pilot with a broken arm, the rest shaken but alive. Smith refused evacuation and stayed with the squadron. For their courage, Juice and Mack would receive the Legion of Merit and the Soldier's Medal. The ruined plane was dragged away, a grim reminder that the war did not need the Japanese to claim American lives. 2 weeks later, the 42nd staged back to Funafuti for another strike against Nauru. On the morning of June 27th, 8 B-24s lined up on the coral runway in the dark. Captain Nicholas Lund, commanding officer of the 26th Squadron, lifted off first in his brand-new Liberator, Knit Clipper. The plane reached perhaps 50 feet of altitude, then nosed down and plunged into the surf, exploding in a ball of fire. Rescue crews pulled 6 wounded men from the burning water, but 4 men, including Lund's nose gunner, a newlywed just back from his honeymoon, were never recovered. The mission was reorganized and the remaining planes began their takeoff rolls. The 8th bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Richard Walgren of the 431st Squadron, climbed to 150 feet and then blew apart in midair. Burning debris rained into the ocean, and this time there were no survivors. 10 men died in that blast. The mission commander, watching from the ground, signaled the remaining planes to abort. 2 bombers, unaware of the cancellation, continued on to Nauru and bombed the island alone. In less than 10 minutes, the squadron had lost 2 aircraft and 14 men to a catastrophe that no one could fully explain. Heavy loads, mechanical failure, a wiring fault, a simple misjudgment on the controls. The cause would never be confirmed. The men on the ground stood in silence, staring at the black smoke drifting over the lagoon. A month later, the squadron gathered its strength for a major raid on Wake Island. On July 24th, 10 Liberators lifted off from Midway and flew into a cold front that hammered the formation with turbulence and zero visibility. 2 planes turned back, but the remaining 8 broke into clear skies 100 miles out and pressed on toward the target. Over Wake, the flak was heavy and accurate, and the Zeros rose to meet the bombers. Lieutenant Jesse Stay led the formation through the bomb runs, and his ship, Dodi Godi, took shrapnel but stayed in the air. Not all were so lucky. Lieutenant James Casson's plane, Cabin in the Sky, was hit by enemy fire, then struck by a falling Zero that a gunner had set ablaze, and the bomber fell 17,000 feet into the sea. All 11 men aboard were killed. The most battered survivor of the raid was Daisy May, flying with Lieutenant Joseph Gall at the controls. A 20-millimeter round tore into the number 2 engine, and a fuel cell fire broke out in the fuselage. Flight engineer Sergeant Arvid Amber smothered the flames with leather jackets. 4 men were wounded, and Sergeant Joseph Evans, hit in the leg by an anti-aircraft round, waved off help and kept working his camera. Evans died on the flight back. With hydraulics shot out and fuel leaking, the crew threw everything loose overboard, guns, ammunition, even the machine guns, to lighten the load. Daisy May reached Midway on fumes and crash-landed on the beach between 2 rows of buried landmines. 700 holes were counted in the fuselage. Lieutenant Stay received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership, and flight engineer Clarence Sopko earned the Silver Star for his courage in repairing the propeller wiring under fire. The squadron had paid a terrible price, but it had struck the enemy hard, and the men still believed they could finish 40 missions and come home. The squadron returned to Oahu for several weeks before staging back to Funafuti in early September. The target now was Tarawa, the linchpin of the Japanese Gilbert Islands defense. For weeks, the 42nd had been softening Japanese positions across the Pacific, and now the Marine Corps was counting on them to pave the way for invasion. On the morning of September 18th, Dogpatch Express led a formation of B-24s north toward Betio Island. The bomb bays were full, the gunners were ready, and the sky was clear. But something was wrong. Navigator Lieutenant Charles Delk, a first lieutenant who outranked every other navigator in the squadron, was hopelessly lost. His skills had rusted during the early years of the war, and over the featureless Pacific, his dead reckoning, the art of calculating position from speed, heading, and time, failed completely. Major Earl Cooper, the squadron commander riding in Dogpatch Express as flight commander, reacted without hesitation. He ordered Delk to the rear of the plane and told him not to come back. The entire formation, following the lead of Dogpatch Express, dumped their bombs into the sea and turned for home. Back on Funafuti, Colonel Hulzapfel met Delk on the flight line and demoted him on the spot, reducing him from first lieutenant to second lieutenant and reassigning him to mess duty. The mission was a total failure, and the root cause was clear. Over the Pacific, a navigational mistake of just 1 degree could mean missing your target by 40 miles. There was no room for error, and no forgiveness for those who made it. The very next day, September 19th, the squadron tried again. 20 B-24s lifted off from Funafuti, and this time found Tarawa without trouble. The bombs fell on Betio's airstrip and oil dump, and the crews watched columns of smoke rise from the island. Flak bursts dotted the sky, and Zeros made several passes, but no American planes were lost and no crewmen were injured. Aboard one bomber, a Marine stowaway who had hidden himself in the rear fuselage appeared, grinning, and helped pass ammunition to the gunners. After the mission, he jumped out of the plane and declared that he had had enough, that he would stick to ground duty from now on. The crew of Dogpatch Express felt, for the first time, that they were making a difference. The pre-invasion bombing was working. The target was visible, the bombs were hitting, and the enemy was taking damage. For men who had watched their first bombs splash into the ocean off Nauru, and who had buried friends after the Japanese raid on Funafuti, this mission was a small but important victory. Morale lifted, if only briefly. On November 13th, the 42nd Bomb Squadron returned to Tarawa for another strike. The mission went smoothly, and Dogpatch Express completed its bomb run and turned for home in formation with another B-24 Virginia Bell, flown by Lieutenant Charles Friedrich. Friedrich had flown as co-pilot on Jesse Stay's crew before getting his own command, and his wife was expecting a child any day. The two bombers flew side by side for hours as the sun set over the Pacific, a beautiful and peaceful end to a successful mission. But Virginia Bell never reached Funafuti. As darkness fell, the plane overshot the island, its navigator failing to identify the narrow coral strip in the blackness. The ground radio station tried to call the bomber, but there was no response. Navy radar operators tracked a blip passing 50 miles south of the island, and fighter planes were scrambled to intercept and lead the lost bomber home. They found nothing. No radio call, no distress signal, no trace. All 10 men aboard Virginia Bell were lost, including Friedrich and his co-pilot, Lieutenant William Morrison, who had been counting the days until his wife's next letter. 2 days later, Scearce was ordered to fly with a different crew. Lieutenant George Deckard, the inexperienced pilot who had landed a B-24 on its tail at Hickam months before, was scheduled to bomb Jaluit Atoll, and his crew was weak on radar. DC sent Scearce along to teach Deckard's radio operator how to use the new equipment. Scearce protested, suggesting he could show them on the ground, but the order stood. He boarded Deckard's plane, nodding Nanette, and took his place at the radio operator's table. The mission to Jaluit was uneventful, but the return flight turned into a nightmare. Midway home, the fuel transfer pump failed, and number 3 engine sputtered and died. Deschert pushed the nose down and dove for the emergency strip at Nanumea. On approach, the nose gear refused to lower. A crewman had carelessly left an ammunition box in the wheel well, blocking the mechanism. Deschert landed on the main gear, held the tail up as long as he could, and then let the plane settle. The nose slammed into the coral runway with a grinding crash, and the crew scrambled out through the top hatch, one man with a broken collarbone. Scearce walked away from the wreck, found a piece of canvas to sleep on, and refused to board the plane that came to pick them up the next morning. He had had enough of Deschert's crew. DC flew over from Funafuti to get him, and Scearce never flew with that crew again. On November 20th, the United States Marine Corps hit the beaches of Tarawa. Scearce and Yankus gathered around the radio in the intelligence hut on Funafuti, expecting to hear news of a quick victory. Instead, they heard desperate voices reporting heavy fire, boats held up on the reef, and men pinned down in the water. The pre-invasion bombing had not destroyed the Japanese defenses. The bombers had missed their marks, and the Marine Corps was paying the price in blood. Scearce walked out of the hut into the tropical sun, fighting back tears. The war in the Pacific was not going to be won by air power alone. It was going to cost more than anyone had imagined. Herman Scearce did not finish his war with a dramatic last mission or a blaze of glory. He flew mission after mission, watching friends vanish into the ocean and replacements arrive with names he never learned. Bob Leip, the easygoing mechanic from Columbiana, Ohio, was killed in a training crash in December 1943. Harold Brooks died on the squadron's first mission to Nauru, struck down by a Japanese round as he manned his waist gun. His name appears among the war dead listed in the July 5, 1943 issue of Life magazine. Russell Phillips and co-pilot Louis Zamperini survived 47 days adrift in life rafts, only to be captured by the Japanese. They spent the rest of the war in prison camps. The other 8 men aboard the Green Hornet were lost at sea. Some men made it home. Ed Hess returned to Chicago, Jack Yankus went home to Easton, Pennsylvania, and worked for the telephone company, and Joe Deasy stayed in the Air Force after the war and retired as a colonel. After the war, Scearce returned to Danville, married, raised a family, and made a quiet life in the textile mills and later in a machine shop. He rarely spoke of the war. What the B-24 crews of the 42nd Bomb Squadron did in the Central Pacific was not glamorous, and it was not well remembered. They flew the longest bombing missions of the war, over water that offered no mercy and no second chances. They navigated by the sun and the stars because there was nothing else to guide them. They were young men who learned through fire and fear and loss that survival was a roll of the dice. And some of them, like Herman Scearce, rolled lucky and finished 40 and came home. If you have a family member who served in the Pacific, or a story of a B-24 crewman that was passed down through your family, we would like to hear it. Share it in the comments below, and we will read them. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling the stories of the men who fought and the men who did not come home. Thank you for listening.